Hey, Will, thanks for joining Techie Personal Finance Bootcamp. I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Lucas.
Yeah, so you're the estate planning expert and attorney, and so there's always a lot of questions that my clients end up running into when it comes to estate planning. There's always a lot of fear and just a lot of stuff that kind of comes up that makes them drag their feet. And even though it's probably one of the most important things to get nailed down, it's sometimes one of the longest ones it takes to actually get implemented when I do recommend it to clients. So super excited to have you. I'm going to ask you a ton of questions. There's probably going to be more things than what we can tackle in today's episode, but just be more of a reason to have you back in the future to kind of join me on more advanced strategies, because I know you specialize in some cool areas too that are very important, worth diving into the finer details to that as well. So as we kick this off and get started, I just want you to kind of introduce yourself, share your background, why you went into estate planning, because there's a lot of times reasons for people to just be like, you know what, I'll just do the online route. I'll go the easy kind of template format and get that to work. And that might be okay in some situations. We might even dive into that a little bit in detail, but you're highly educated and it's required for you to be highly educated for your role. So yeah, share with me your background and kind of what got you into estate planning.
Sure. So, who am I? So my name is William Beyers the third. So I was actually born and raised in Loveland, Colorado. So, living in Fort Collins currently, but have been in the area for a long time. I went to University of Colorado for undergrad. Graduated from school 2010. Took a half victory lap, did 4.5 years, but and then I actually worked in Denver in political media buying for a couple of years, and then decided to finally make good on that long time thought of going the law school route. And that seed had really been planted because my father's a lawyer. He's been
Yep.
practicing for about almost 40 years now,
Wow.
and so people would always say, "Oh, well, Bill Jr., you're going to be a lawyer too." And I had never. It had always been in my mind, but I guess I hadn't really done the adult thing of fleshing out just what exactly I really want to do with my life. And
Sure.
so, in my mid-20s, I decided to go to law school. Went to University of Nebraska, met my wife. She was in Omaha at the time, so I met my wife during that period, and then we moved back to Colorado, and I started practicing with my father, who I've now been with for about 6 years. So,
That's awesome. And one thing I just want to point out is that it's so cool that like that wasn't necessarily on your radar and you just decided that, yep, that is what I'm going to do, or at least kind of go to law school and make sure that that's still something you want to do. And then you met your wife there, because you wouldn't have met her otherwise unless some other kind
exactly.
of event would have ran you into each other. So it's always cool when I think about my life and a lot of my clients' lives, like how they describe things that just kind of occur. And yeah, it was on your radar, the first kind of normal route of going through school. And yeah, you eventually found yourself to it and found yourself to your wife. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, and even funnier, I mean, the stars really aligned. So my parents actually met at the University of Nebraska. Um,
That's crazy.
yeah, and they were introduced by a man named Dan Muffley, who is still a good friend of my father's, and is actually has a law practice in Fort Collins.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so very
that's amazing.
it's weird how things work out sometimes, but that's yeah, very grateful that I met my wife back there. And then as far as kind of the second part of your question, really, how did we get into this area of the law? My again, there's always a longer winded story than there's time for, but
Sure. Yep.
now you've heard about how Bill Senior has been a long time attorney. So he wasn't always an estate planning attorney. We weren't always in this sector, but he just my grandmother, his mom, she had a stroke at 70. Came out of nowhere, and she was basically in a vegetative state for 9.5 years.
Holy moly.
Yeah, it was a pretty brutal set of circumstances, and it was just kind of dealing with all of that. It really kind of opened up our eyes to everything that can happen in that incapacity and death realm.
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
kind of how to make things easier in an uneasy, set of circumstances. Excuse me. So I had seen that. I had obviously been exposed to that, but that was actually the nexus for my dad to start specializing in estate planning and this long-term care and special needs planning, because he
Yeah.
just realized how during all this time when he was trying to help his mom, he had made calls all over the state of Nebraska to attorneys that, he had heard might be able to help, and he just couldn't find any good help with it. And so he said, there's got to be somebody who's competent in this arena that can at least kind of help us stop the bleeding. And when that didn't exist, he decided that he would start educating himself and looking for what resources were out there, and kind of, like many people, he just said, oh, well, this is something that's needed, and so I guess I'll figure it out as I go.
Yeah, one that's a pretty brutal experience that you guys had to go through, and that it's common, right? Sometimes it's not always at 70, sometimes it's 75 or 80, but that kind of transition, all the things that kind of domino after that or during that whole situation, it's a stressful time, a tough time, and you and your father at least had that background of kind of that lawyer base, so you're able to navigate the system probably better than most people. But yeah, I can definitely see why that would motivate him, and then you kind of consequently being like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and you are helping people well before they need that help most of the time. So that's kind of a weird thing for people to grasp, that yeah, you really want to get these in place before you actually need them, because when you actually need them, you can't, you're probably not around, or something happened, you're not able to handle those things. So all in all, just kind of jumping back to your schoolwork and kind of background, how many years of school like did you have to go through to call yourself a lawyer and be able to do estate planning?
Sure. So I went to I got my undergraduate degree at University of Colorado. So did 4 years there, and then 3 years at University of Nebraska for my JD.
Yeah, holy moly. And then is there some type of test, like a formal test at the end, or just getting your JD in the 3 years was sufficient to say, yep, you're a lawyer now? Well,
Nope, there's really two components. So there's an MPRE, which is a multi-state ethical exam. So we had to take that during our third year. So you have to pass that, and then you also had to pass the so Nebraska, there's this thing called the uniform bar exam, and I think
yep.
there's 30 something states that are a part of it, but they're essentially a cohort of states that have said, these are the requirements we're going to have for you to practice law in these states. And they're called UBE states, uniform bar exam. And so Nebraska is a UBE state, Wyoming's a UBE state, and Colorado is a UBE state. So kind of the second part of that was, once I had graduated from law school, then I took the bar exam after that. So
yeah, sounds intense. That's a ton of school. I took a long victory lap to use your kind of definition of the situation where I didn't know what I wanted to do for the longest time. So instead of going through 4 years and then figuring out like, oh yeah, I want to do something else, it took me a good probably like 6 years before I figured it out. Then I moved to Colorado to go for financial planning, and all in all, it took like, I think it was about 9 years, I think, for me to get my graduate degree. So yeah, I definitely understand having to go through school and kind of taking a long-winded way to do it. But you actually were doing school 7.5 years out of that time frame. So that's pretty intense. It takes a lot of education, a lot of kind of determination to rock through that whole period of time. So yeah, super, super valuable to know that you're knowledgeable when you're working on people's important documents. We can kind of dive next into like how would you describe those kind of important core documents? So we're not going to dive into the trust just yet, but like a will, financial power of attorney, living wills, those things, like how would you briefly describe each of those? And because that's something where a lot of times people, when they think of estate documents, they just think a will is going to cover them, or just naming someone their beneficiaries on their 401k is enough estate planning. And usually it's not, right?
Yeah. Now, much like with financial planning, Lucas, be wary of any lawyer who tells you that you need a certain thing. Now, there are consistent components. I have a lot of people who ask me, they say, if you could only start with let's say we have no money and we just need to start getting some stuff in place. No matter your age, no matter your background, get good powers of attorney in place tomorrow. that's the best way to protect yourself in a timely fashion, because everybody can utilize financial powers of attorney and healthcare powers of attorney. And so what those are is they're essentially a legal document that states who you would like to act on your behalf if you're unable to communicate with a banker or a hospital advisor. Basically, if you're laid out, you can't answer questions or make decisions. Who do you want to step into your shoes and make those decisions for you?
Yep.
And so for pretty much every estate plan, you're going to have a financial power of attorney and a healthcare power of attorney that states these are the individuals that I would want making decisions for me if I'm unable to do so. So those are the kind of the branches of the estate planning tree. And then the trunk, as you discussed, is really the will. So a will is just a document that says, upon my death, I want my property to go to these people in these metrics or these forms, and I want this person to administer, the personal representative or executor or executrix. That is really quarterback of the estate planning, of the probate situation. So really, a will just kind of says who you want involved, where you want the property to go.
Yeah. Yep. And it's important, right? Because one of the things that I commonly get when I ask like those types of questions in the first couple of meetings is like, well, what if you were going to die tomorrow or next year, 5 years from now? Like, what's going through your mind? And I'd say a good chunk of my clients, they say, you know what, I want to get my stuff in order. It feels like there's a mess. It feels like there might be fighting within family and things like that without me putting these things in place. But then that's something I help them with, and then I send them over your way, or depending on what state they're in, to a local person to them. And yeah, it's a huge help for them to just understand like what these pieces mean. And one thing you mentioned is you mentioned the powers of attorney, you mentioned the will. Technically, you can name the same person as like the primary person to act in your capacity for all of them, or you can name a different person for all of them. And I think that's important too, because I think sometimes people get hung up like, well, I want this person to do these things, but I know they can't do this other thing. So, and they drag their feet. Well, you can name different people, and you can name backup people too, right?
That's correct. That is correct. And you're, that's a good point, because oftentimes I see it with parent, and you're a parent, I'm a parent. So we're familiar with, they want everybody to be involved. They don't want any child left out. So it's my job really to counsel them and say, hey, nobody's arguing that you don't love your children. Any parent would, but we need to know who's going to be the best decision maker in a tough situation. That's the thing to remember, is that when these documents come into play, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be in an ugly situation, whether mom had a stroke, or there was a car wreck, or you're just getting older and you have dementia. I mean, it's at the point that these documents become effective, it's going to be a tough situation for the family. And so it's important to remember that that is a component of it, whether people choose to acknowledge and internalize that or not, because that's going to come into play when your child or whoever it is you designate actually has to come to the table and act.
Yep. And in some cases too, this happened to me and my wife this summer. So during the summer, we have our baby now, but she was pregnant with our baby, went to the hospital, had to stay like multiple nights. We didn't know when they were going to let her go. We were also trying to close on our house. And so it was like, hey, we have those financial power of attorneys. We had like packed up all the boxes. So I had to go digging through the boxes to find the financial power of attorney. But like that was a need that luckily nothing bad was happening, nothing horrible, but she wasn't necessarily going to be set free just because we needed to close on a house. So luckily I had those documents in place. And so, yeah, there's a lot of value and flexibility, and how it works is I named her as the primary, and then I have a backup. So if something happened to both of us, basically those documents are totally worthless. Tell me a little bit about your kind of thought process. So if someone came to you, you kind of mentioned like, yep, powers of attorneys are definitely the two most important. What kind of characteristic or specific scenario would you say, yeah, you really need some more estate documents? Like you definitely need a will, or you definitely need a trust. Like what situation would you kind of tell that to someone?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I've kind of realized recently that I look at almost all things through a risk reward prism.
Mhm.
And so I hedge a lot, as the financial experts will be familiar with. And
Yep,
so
it depends.
um, I while recognizing that everyone's circumstances are different, I also, I mean, I have incredibly wealthy clients. I have clients who have dedicated their lives to their church, and they have no
Mhm.
interest in money. So I think that's really kind of the starting thing, is that I could give you the Cadillac of Cadillacs for your estate planning documents, but if it doesn't make sense for your circumstances, it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
And so I really kind of look at it as my job, and what we do in our initial consultations is I need to I need to get to know you. I want to
Mhm.
hear about your family. I want to hear about the people who are important to you, about your background, your assets, kind of what's going on. And then I'm going to give you the estate planning options. I'm going to walk you through them, tell you what they do, and kind of why we do certain things or appreciate certain things. I'm going to give you the pros and cons of everything, and then it's your job to make a decision. And so when I'm
Mhm.
doing this with these clients, or with these new clients, I almost always start with uh, defining a trust versus a will. And so, kind
Yep.
of going back to that estate planning being a tree analogy, really the trunk can be either the will or a trust.
Mhm.
And so, I think that everybody should have a will or a trust, should have something that clearly states where you would like your property to
Yep.
go if something happens to you. But truthfully, there is an alarming amount of people who die without any sort of documentation in place.
Yeah, and I'm sure it drives you nuts every time you see it. But like any of those wealthy celebrity stars, millions, millions, millions net
Prince,
worth. Yeah, Prince. Like you can just name off like half of them. Like there's a good chance half of them have not put the proper documents in place, and it just causes nightmares for the people that get left behind.
yeah, and that's the most jarring. I was just talking about this last week. Is the Prince scenario where, I mean, you talk about an accomplished musician, somebody who did so many incredible things in their career, and now all of his work is going to be just depleted, so I mean greatly and unnecessarily, by fighting family members, because
Yeah.
it wasn't clearly lined up who was to be involved, who was to get what. And it's kind of tragic, honestly.
Yep. Yep. And that brings up another kind of big question that I kind of listen and kind of look for when I'm talking about estate planning with clients, trying to figure out, well, should I tell them to bring up a trust with their estate planning attorney, or is it most likely going to be a will for them? Because some attorneys definitely will say, hey, you know what, you need a trust, when they don't. But one of the things that kind of pops up is, well, I want to keep this private. I don't want this to go through court. In what situation would that be appropriate for us?
That I'm going to utilize the trust 10 times out of 10 if privacy
Yeah.
is a concern, because a will, by its definition, has to go through probate,
Mhm.
and probate is a public it's a matter of public record.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter when you died or who died. If there was a probate in Colorado opened, I can find the records on it, and so can everybody else.
Yep. So yeah,
So
think about those relatives that, yeah, always come around asking for things, or and sometimes it might not even be relatives you've ever met or know. It might.
ex-wives,
Yep.
in-laws that you just never even knew. Like it's any number of things.
Yep. And so that's one thing that kind of highlights it. If someone has like a ton of wealth and children, that's kind of like two combination things where, yeah, a lot of wealth and young children. That makes me think, well, someone probably needs to manage this, and I kind of tend to lean towards a trust. But I think most importantly, even before we get to the money management and kind of taking care of that, is, well, who's going to take care of the kids? How is that addressed? That's one of the things that really sticks out to me, is like, we need to have some estate planning just so in-laws aren't fighting over that, because every grandma is going to think that they're the ones that their daughter or son or daughter and son-in-law, or whatever the situation is, like, they wanted me to take care of those kids. They wanted me
Yeah.
to raise those kids. But the other grandma might be thinking the same thing.
That's very funny timing, because I was literally talking about this with my brother earlier today.
Mhm.
So the way that I looked at it, and I kind of have the obvious practice standpoint of doing this with other people, but then also having to do it with myself now.
Yep.
And so, really, the way that we looked at it was, if God forbid something happened to mom and I, then that is going to be an incredibly tragic and violent situation in my son's life.
Mhm.
Mom and dad are gone, and that is I mean, there's no bandaging up over that. And so, really, what we looking at it through that frame, we said we want as little change as possible for him. We want stability as much as we can get it. And my family is in Loveland. I grew up in Loveland. We live in Fort
Mhm.
Collins, and so they're close by. And he actually goes down to his grandma and grandpa's at least 3 times a week. And
Oh,
so,
awesome.
which is an awesome thing, because my grandparents lived out of state. I didn't get to see them as much as I'd wanted to. And so it's really great to have them there as, somebody to lean on, but also because, Charlie gets to grow up with them. And so really we decided, fairly easily, that it would be my parents who took care of him, because, again, it's never going to be an easy situation no matter what.
Mhm.
And Charlie absolutely adores all of his grandparents. I had wonderful
Yep.
in-laws, but they're in Iowa, which is where my wife is from. And
Okay.
so, if they've if we're gone and they're dealing with all the mess of that, then the last thing you want to do is be moving a small child as well.
Yep.
So, getting him enrolled in a new school, that's not so. Charlie, if that happened, then hopefully Charlie has friends in this area, or he's playing sports, and at least he can have some semblance of normalcy. So
Yep.
that's really how we looked at it when we were deciding who would take care of him if something happened to us. And then you also have to ask that question as far as the financial side of it, of if we leave behind a bunch of money,
Yep.
who's gonna manage that effectively. And I think, just the same, you have to take an honest, hard look and say who's going to do a good job, and who is going to protect our son's interests if that were
Yep.
to happen.
Yep. And yeah, what I see a lot of time is like there's someone that's like, oh yeah, this person would be a good caretaker, do great, amazing job raising Charlie or any of my 4 kids or all of my
Sure.
4 kids in my situation. But then maybe they're not like the best financially. They're not the most financially savvy, and yes, they could hire people. But maybe there is someone that's like, oh yeah, I think they'd get along well and be able to coordinate this up. But this person will manage the finances, and this person will raise my kids. And again, sometimes it's the same person for both of those, and that's a really easy situation. And sometimes it's, as you go through that thought process, you just want to do what you think is best as it is today.
Exactly. And everybody's situation is going to be different, because for some people it's family members. Other people don't have that, or they don't have reliable ones. So, you just really, as a parent, and that's kind of the fun thing that we get to deal with now, is that we're the parents. We're so used, for the longest time, we were, responding to our parents, and we probably, well, I still do in plenty of cases, but
Yep.
we just have to look at it for our kids and say, okay, what is going, if we meet this, this ugly situation, how can we protect Charlie, or, your kids the best? Who's going to look out for them?
Yep. So estate planning, not the most fun topic to tackle. I actually had a lot of fun working with you and one of my clients on this. So like probably the most fun of experience someone can have as far as going through estate planning is working with you. I've had clients go through other people, and they were less than thrilled about their experience. But yeah, it's not the most fun thing to say, yep, I'm going to do this. This is going to be a fun time. It's no, you're doing it because it's very important to get these things done. What would you say are probably the biggest obstacles to actually deciding that, yes, they're going to get estate planning documents, but then actually start taking steps to get the ball rolling and get these things completed?
Well, so it's funny. I actually have I have Memento Mori tattooed on my shoulder, which means remember death. And so it's a Stoic philosophy. It was a
Yep.
long practice throughout time to meditate on death and on your eventual demise, because the reality of, and it's so funny to me, because obviously we're intelligent people, and we've got an incredibly complex and advanced society, but it takes so many people so long to realize that they're actually going to die. There's going to be a day where they don't wake up.
Yeah.
Like it's coming for everyone, but we just don't like to recognize it. And so I think a lot of times people end up in our office because they had a loved one experience something tragic recently. They've seen it up close. They've had a front row seat to one of the tragic life events that usually only happens in the newspapers.
Yeah.
And so when you see it happen in your family's realm, you go, wow, I don't want my loved ones to have to deal with these problems that I've seen could arise. Because, there are a million things that we tell ourselves every day, Lucas, that we should get done, but we just don't have the time because we're chasing around kids, or we're trying to, there's only so many things you can focus on. And I mean, believe me, I put off getting a new dentist for like longer than I should have as an adult, certainly. And I justify it to myself because I'm going, oh gosh, well, I'm going to be embarrassed. It's been like 2 years since my cleaning, and I don't have the time or whatever. But the reality of it is, we know the right thing to do. We know what it is. We know we should pick up the phone and call the dentist or the lawyer or whoever. And because the reason is because we're good people who want to take care of our families if something terrible happens. I would imagine you love your kids more than anybody else in the world, and you would not want them to suffer unnecessarily if dad was taken away. I mean, I think that's a pretty natural, consistent thread throughout humans. And so really where I try to kind of bridge that gap for people, because it happened, it happens to me, is this is not a fun thing to talk about. And it may never be a fun thing for you to talk about, but it can be an easier thing to talk. It doesn't have to be easy, but I can make it easier. And so what I've always learned is that when I finally have a good so my accountant's a great example. I put off getting an accountant for the longest time, and now I would take a bullet for that man. So he makes my life so much easier. And like many things, for one reason or another, maybe it's just because we're busy adults, we procrastinate on it. And we turn it into something in our head that it actually isn't. And so I think you just need to do your research and find good attorney. Certainly always ask your friends, family, if they've had good experiences. But then also you got to find somebody who you jive with. I mean, it's got to be a good fit. And so I have our practice. My father and I have set up our practice as a practice that we would want to go to. We're trying to employ the things that we appreciate from our accountants and our doctors and that group, because I kind of look at it as, having a good accountant, financial guy, having, whatever your lot in life is. If you're a vet and you've got, the people you buy from or you deal with on that, you have to have a good team. To be successful in anything, you have to have a good team, because we can only focus on so much. You're the finance guy. And so things that I'm never going to understand financially, but that's because that's your lane. That's what you're good at. And so, I mean, it's kind of egotistical for me to think that I can do it as well as you. Like, I don't have the time. Like, I wasn't sitting there reading the books when you were. And so I think really the best way you can put yourself in place to succeed long-term is to start getting those people in place. And so I would say, just ask around, ask your friends if they know of a good attorney. Maybe do some research on Google or some, I don't know. A lot of times if you go to the gym or, the YMCA or something, they'll have little informational stands or something. But I think reach out to your group, ask them if they have attorneys that they use and that they like, and then just pick up the phone and call.
Yeah. And I think, although it's not fun, one of the things I do see from clients once they get this knocked out is they're so proud of themselves. They're like, yep, like I made it to the finish line. Like, I'm so relieved. I'm so kind of proud. And that's important too. So there's a good chance that just in your regular daily life, you come across someone that just finished that and they told you, like, yep, I'm going to get my estate documents notarized today. Like, that's a good time to be like, oh, what's that person's name and contact information? Because you want to kind of ride that momentum, and yeah, they'll by saying that to them or talking to them, that they're kind of going to hold you accountable. At
Right.
least in your mind, you'll hold yourself accountable. Like, hey, I just asked for for that information. They're probably going to check in on me to see if I reach out. So yeah,
Yep.
definitely a good hack to try to get yourself to do something that you need to get done anyways.
Absolutely.
So I think that the last big question that I have for you that kind of pops in my head is, so there are those other routes that people can go. They technically, you don't even need a template, right? Someone can technically write something down on paper and try to say that, like, hey, this is my will, hey, this is my power of attorney, and things like that. When you just kind of think about people that don't work with an actual professional, what's the most common kind of mistakes that you see? Or even just kind of what's the craziest mistake you've ever seen too, just with estate documents, even if they did work with an attorney, maybe the attorney actually didn't get to know them. And I see that a lot on the financial planning side, kind of sadly, is like, yeah, they're working with a financial advisor, but then they're not doing the same things that I would be doing. And so we catch a lot of things and find things. So I'm sure that you're cleaning up some other messes too, even from professionals sometimes.
Yeah, I still remember the first time I got a phone call about transferring the IRA into the trust, and I said, no, 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 I do not. Will Byers did not tell you to do that.
Yep. Yep. And so really quick, the reason why we don't want to do that, trusts pay at a way higher tax rate.
Well, so to clarify, so if I was setting up trust for you, Lucas, and we set up your family trust, and you then tried to take your 401k, well, which is in your individual name, and you tried to move it into the trust, that's an immediately taxable event.
Yep. Yep.
So actually what we tend to do, and again, it's all situation specific, but usually we'll leave a spouse first as a beneficiary because they have much better, rollover benefits, etc. And then we'll often use a trust as the secondary beneficiary. But, getting back to your question, I think the biggest thing is that you don't have a person to call. That's the reality of it, because life exists in the gray area. And what happens, sure, those documents, they may work. I mean, I'll tell you every day of the week that you ask me, oh, do I need an attorney to do these documents? No, you don't. Like, legally, you can prepare them yourself. Like, go to the statutes, look at what's required for an effective power of attorney, and do it yourself. Like, you can do it. I'm telling you, legally, you can do it. But what happens if you were in my family situation with my grandmother? Well, is it going to address situations like that? Is it going to allow you to, is a bank account or a bank department, are they going to honor it when, your spouse comes in with this handwritten power of attorney? Do you think they're going to give your spouse access to your funds right away? I can tell you right away, they won't. They're going to say,
I worked at banks, and yeah, that was definitely something where even sometimes like the official documents, it just takes a little bit longer if those things aren't already on file. They're not like, hey, we're going to be needing these here soon. So those things aren't going to happen quickly. But yeah, with the handwritten one, I would have thought, did you just do this in the car right now and trying to con me, steal my client's money or my customers, members' money at the credit union and stuff like that?
Yeah, exactly. And so really where I think it's effective to have an attorney, regardless of what you need legal documents for, is I tell people all the time, I have my circle of competence, and I really don't practice outside of the estate planning and elder law umbrella. If somebody has even the slightest bit complex business question, I'm going to send them to one of the attorneys that I've worked with who I know specialize in that, because I want them to get the right answer. And it's stressful for me if it's not my expertise, because the laws are always changing. So really, I think that where I provide ongoing value for my clients, and this isn't just me selling myself, but where I actually look at my job and go, okay, objectively, this is how I'm providing value, is when the bank doesn't honor that power of attorney and they let me know, and then I'm getting on the phone with somebody and oh yeah, it gets squared away because we got a letter from the attorney verifying that this was the way it's, kind of those things. It's not just because with all this, it's really just purchasing insurance in one fashion. You're hoping that this bad event doesn't happen, but you recognize that it may happen. And so you're trying to at least, provide some protection for yourself if it does happen. So really where I just kind of I give it a little shot in the arm when that bad event does really happen. And apologize, I'm getting some messages and I hope it's not pinging on it. But so, really, I cannot tell you, nor can anybody tell you when you're going to have to use those documents and what the circumstances are going to look like. But I can tell you that I've dealt with a lot of those situations, and I've been with a lot of families during those grieving, tough times, and I've helped them solve their problems, and I've seen what works and what doesn't work and what's effective and not effective. And I can never guarantee that it will work for you, but I can tell you that it's, at least when there's wreckage around, I'm not going to be running for the door. I can at least kind of help us figure out, get our bearings, and what's going to be the best way to just protect the family in that situation.
Yeah, when that's what it's all about, right? Is just making sure things are in place to protect your loved ones, the ones that are going to be left behind, or maybe you're just incapacitated and someone to kind of step in for you in those situations. When I think of why, and one of the reasons why clients hire me too, it's kind of the same thing. Like, yes, they can figure out their own financial stuff. They can do their own investments, but it's kind of that initial step that you take and that I take with my clients is getting to understand, well, who are you? What's your unique situation? What are the things that you value? And how can we make sure that we make a plan for that, but then also be flexible because life is constantly changing. We might protect and kind of plan for 80% of the things that most likely are going to happen. But what about that 1% or 10%, or even some of those basic things like, hey, they're not accepting this. Like what's going on? Like they could still be around and they're trying to get a trust set up. And I see it all the time, even on my end, not necessarily the estate planning side of things or documents, but people give out bad information all the time. The service providers at Fidelity, they'll say, oh, nope, you can't do that, or this is how you have to do that. And then if I'm not on the call with my clients, like I need to be there to kind of protect them from the bad advice from the entry level person or someone that thinks they're doing good and they're stepping outside of their bounds to try to help, and it's really messing things up. So it's pretty interesting because you gain so many insights with all the different experiences that your clients have had, both heard and both experience that you're helping them through. And I see those types of things all the time where you'll end up adding value in ways that you don't even imagine that you do. And so it's just cool to have that team of experts, like you said. And if I ever run into anything, I know I have you in my corner. I can say, hey, Will's either going to help you take care of this, or I'm going to ask him a question. And if we need to kind of figure out how to get something resolved or get the answers that someone needs, building that team of experts definitely gives you peace of mind, gives you confidence, and it allows them to focus on the things that they enjoy, allows me to focus on my financial stuff, you to focus on the estate stuff. And then at the end of the day, there's all the stuff outside of your work too that you want to be able to focus on and enjoy. So your family, my family, where I don't want to have to be stressed out like, hey, I totally went off the rails and trying to do too much without expertise guidance in some areas.
Yeah. And so kind of on that thought, have you read the book, So Good They Can't Ignore You?
No, but it almost sounds more like a movie.
So kind of going back to the memento mori and my tattoo and the stoicism stuff, Ryan Holiday has a podcast, and probably the greatest modern writer on stoicism there is, FYI, if you're interested in stoicism. But he had this guy, Cal Newport, who wrote So Good They Can't Ignore You on his podcast. And it was such a good podcast and everything he said was so good that I took down the name of the book. And it's a fascinating book, but it talks about how it basically says that chasing your passion to find your job, to find the right job, the dream job, is the wrong thing to do. Oh. And so he says there are two approaches that exist, and there's the passion approach and the craftsman approach. And the passion approach asks what the world can give to you, but the craftsman approach focuses on what you can give to the world.
Oh, wow.
And he found time and time and time again with all these successful studies, these men who are far successful than we will ever be. And he said, if you focus on the process and you focus on being good at what it is that you're doing at that time in your life, whatever it is, then, so like you and I'm not going to go home and try to do day trading. It's just not in the card. I'm going to focus on being a good lawyer for my clients. And then I'm going to go home and I'm going to do the family thing just as you do. And so you have to realize that you can't do it all. And so I read that recently, and I thought that was a great takeaway, is that, that's a good way to kind of remember that you need a team. Everyone needs a team, and you need to focus on what it is that and find other good people who can handle the sides that you don't.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. That probably like highlights too, like why people can love what they do, not necessarily because of the passion, but because of the value that they're putting out into the world. And so like, there's like morticians and like all kinds of things that you'd never think like people enjoy their jobs, and all the times you see like, oh yeah, they're super happy.
Yeah.
It's probably because they take that craftsman approach as far as like the value that they're putting out into the world, and that's making them feel good. And yeah, who's to argue against that, right?
Exactly.
Perfect. Any closing thoughts or kind of words of wisdom on the estate planning that you'd like to share before we jump off today?
Honestly, I don't, nothing that wouldn't take up another 2 hours. So, no, I guess I'll just thank you for inviting me on, and I hope to do this again.
Perfect. Yeah. And I really appreciate you coming on. Well, Will is in Northern Colorado. And so that's mainly where you practice, right? Or do you serve all of Colorado? Do you serve any other kind of neighboring states?
Depending on the circumstances, we often will serve other parts of Colorado. Now our focus is always going to be kind of that northern I-25 corridor. But we have active clients in Colorado Springs and Telluride and kind of all over the place. So we do serve other areas as well.
Okay, perfect. Oh, one question I actually want to ask for myself personally, but I could see one of the issues why people drag their feet is because, well, what if something changes? What if I have another kid? And that's my example because we had our first child when we got all of our documents in place. We've had multiple children since then. How does that work, and how would you kind of relieve someone of not putting it off until they're done having kids, or because they're worried about kind of life changing and things like that?
Oh, just to tell me that. That's why I have a concerns assessment on my intake form, because if somebody said, well, what I'm holding off for is because we're trying for more, my wife and I, we hope to have another child. But if somebody said that to me and they said, hey, I'm holding off on doing my will because I don't want to have to change again, I would say, literally just give me a call if you have another kid, and I will change it for free for you. If that's what's holding you up, please, there are many easy ways to address that. Don't overthink it. We could even take care of that problem ahead of time and just use a class of people and say my children rather than my child. There's plenty of ways to address that issue. Like if you're anything like me, you're probably overthinking it, and that's why you should just go to somebody in the sector and ask them your questions.
Yep. Perfect. And yeah, I need to look at the documents and see if they identified it as a class, but I know, I think in your documents, was that your default, or is that because my client requested that? I think.
Oh, so I use classes regularly.
Yep, perfect. Yep. Yeah. And so that's one way that you think ahead of time and are doing kind of that proactive work that maybe like an online platform or even just writing something for yourself isn't going to necessarily do.
And also what is part of our trust planning process, because we do flat fees for all of our estate planning. If you're a client of ours and you've established a trust with our office, we have a complimentary review every 3 years, so that, if we haven't already talked with you, then we can just go and grab coffee and you can let me know if anything's changed in your life, because that's about as good of a way as exists to head off, to be more preventative and make sure that, we're never going to be able to control what the laws are. But if I know something's coming around the pike, there's a very good chance we can get out in front of it and, make any changes ahead of time.
Yep. Perfect. Yep. I appreciate you answering those questions for me. And if someone wanted to reach out to you, best way to go to a website, find you on LinkedIn, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Certainly my email is probably the quickest way.
Okay.
And would you like me to list that for listeners, or are you going to attach that?
You can go ahead and say it out loud just in case
Okay.
anyone's listening and they happen to have a pen, but otherwise I'll add in the show notes still for someone to copy and paste later.
Sure. So website is always great. Our website is buyerslaw.com, and our last name Beyers is spelled B as in boy, EYERS. So my email address is will@buyerslaw.com. And I'm like many people, I'm checking my email throughout the day. So that's usually going to be the quickest way to get an answer, because we are a small office, and so there's only one of me, and I'm in meetings a lot of the day, but
Yep.
I'll always get back to you, regardless of how you reach out.
Perfect. I really appreciate it. Well,
All right. Thanks a lot, Lucas.
yep, thanks, Will.